Why are Europeans and Asians so different when there was once a time with no Europe, no Asia, no countries, no borders, no names for continents at all? There were only humans, small groups walking, following food, following water, reacting to the land in front of them. Some moved toward colder places, others followed rivers in warmer seasons. They didn't know they were separating history into different paths. They weren't building civilizations or identities. They were just trying to survive, unaware that those quiet choices would shape everything that came after. Because before there were continents to name or histories to separate, the species itself nearly vanished. There was a period when the world tightened around human life so severely that survival stopped being expected and became accidental. Climate patterns shifted beyond recognition. Rain failed where it had always arrived. Cold lingered longer than memory could explain. Large animals that once fed entire groups grew scarce, then disappeared from familiar routes. Plants that had sustained people for generations failed in places remembered as safe. Small bands were forced into constant calculation, whether to walk farther or starve sooner, whether to stay together or risk losing children, whether to spend energy hunting or spend it moving towards somewhere that might still work. Most groups lost that calculation, not because they were weaker, but because the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. What survived that pressure was not humanity in full, but a narrow passage, a bottleneck so severe it erased possibilities without intention. Threats did not disappear because they were inferior, but because the people who carried them did not live long enough to pass them on. This is why the beginning matters, not as myth, but as constraint. The remaining population was small enough that every future difference had to grow from nearly the same starting point. The same bodies adapted for endurance, the same minds capable of learning, the same human potential compressed into a few thousand lives, possibly fewer. If one child from that time had been raised anywhere among those groups, there would have been no visible difference, no east, no west, just humans responding to pressure. In that early world, no one belonged to a place in the way we understand it now. Belonging was temporary, attached to the group you moved with, not the land beneath your feet. Groups were small enough that every absence was noticed. Knowledge lived entirely in people, which routes were safe, which water made you sick, what the sky looked like before a storm, how to keep fire alive through a wet night. If the person who held that knowledge died, the knowledge could die with them. The world did not reward confidence, it rewarded accuracy. Attention mattered more than belief. Cooperation at this stage was not a value, it was the only workable design. Hunting required coordination, protection required numbers. Children survived because multiple adults watched them, not because anyone had a theory about community. Leadership was situational. The person who had survived more winters was listened to, not obeyed. Authority faded when conditions changed. Long-term planning existed, but it was fragile. Preparation helped, but it did not guarantee safety. Seasons shifted unpredictably. Animals changed routes without warning. The future could not be trusted long enough to build elaborate systems around it. People learned to live close to the present, not because they lacked imagination, but because imagination did not keep you alive when the land stopped cooperating. Culture existed, but it was light. Heavy traditions do not travel well when you might have to leave tomorrow. Stories were practical. They encode routes, dangers, and warnings. Tools were simple but refined through repetition. Fire was not technology. It was life support. As instability continued, the simplest solution was movement, not exploration, not conquest. When a place stopped feeding you, you walked. When water failed, you followed what you could find. When animals shifted, you shifted with them. Generation by generation, survivors began stretching outward, carrying the same narrow human inheritance into unfamiliar landscapes. No one understood this as separation. There was no sense of leaving something behind. There were no maps, no borders, no idea that distance itself would matter. But movement does not distribute experience evenly. Each new place responded differently to effort. Some punished mistakes immediately, others delayed consequence. Some demanded preparation, others demanded responsiveness. What you notice every day eventually becomes what you prepare for. What you prepare for eventually becomes what you expect. At first, these expectations were barely visible. Groups were still similar enough that if they met, they would have understood one another easily. They would have shared food. They would have exchanged techniques. But as routes lengthened and returns became less likely, contact-thin knowledge stopped circulating as freely. The shared pool of experience that had once smoothed out difference began fragmenting quietly, without conflict, without awareness. None of this felt like change from the inside. Life still felt ordinary. People adapted the way they always had. Parents taught children what had worked for them. Elders passed on lessons proven by survival. No one sensed a turning point. But the world was beginning to reward different habits in different places, and repetition was doing what repetition always does, slowly turning response into instinct, and instinct into something that no longer felt chosen. And as those instincts settled in without being named, they began shaping how people moved, how they waited, and how they judged risk, long before anyone was aware that judgment itself was changing. In places where cold lingered and food vanished for long stretches, the cost of error stretched across months, not days, so attention narrowed toward anticipation, and restraint toward storing what could be stored and avoiding actions that might waste effort. In other places, where water arrived suddenly and left just as quickly, the danger came from hesitation rather than loss, so attention widened toward timing and coordination, toward acting together when conditions briefly allowed it. Neither approach came from belief or intention. Each emerged, because the land punished one mistake more harshly than another, again and again, until behavior adjusted without conscious thought. As these adjustments repeated, movement itself began to change. People still walked, still followed animals and seasons, but wandering grew more selective. Certain valleys proved safer. Returning to what had worked before reduced risk, and reduced risk felt like progress in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Gradually, paths curved back on themselves. Circles replaced long arcs. Distance grew between groups, not because anyone chose separation, but because staying near what worked felt safer than crossing into the unknown again. This quiet narrowing reduced contact in ways no one noticed at the time. Meetings between distant groups became rarer, then brief, then unexpected. Knowledge that once flowed freely stopped traveling far enough to average out. Experience, a technique refined in one place, no longer reached another. A mistake corrected in one region continued elsewhere. Experience began pooling locally, shaped by the same pressures, repeating on the same people. Over time, that repetition did what no decision ever could. It preserved difference. Children born into these environments learned the world through consequence rather than explanation. They watched what adults worried about and what they ignored. They learned how much preparation was enough by seeing what happened when preparation failed. They learned how much cooperation was required by noticing when acting alone caused harm. These lessons formed a baseline sense of normal long before language could describe it. Anything outside that baseline felt unsafe, even if it worked somewhere else. Natural barriers quietly reinforced this process. Mountains slowed movement without forbidding it. Deserts discouraged return without sealing passage completely. Forests made travel costly enough that fewer people attempted it. Each barrier increased friction, and friction reduced exchange. Reduced exchange allowed local habits to persist unchallenged. No wall was needed. Distance itself did the work. You were still defined by who you moved with, not by abstract belonging. Language shifted quickly. Words mattered only if they worked. There was no loyalty to dialect or custom, no reverence for tradition as an idea. Tradition was memory that kept you alive. But as fewer new methods arrived from outside, what you already knew gained weight simply because it was familiar. The shared human past did not disappear. It faded from relevance when survival demands constant attention to the present. Distant memory loses urgency. Each generation inherited less knowledge about faraway lands and more knowledge about local risks. It was compression. Attention narrowed because it had to. From the inside, nothing felt divided. Life continued as adaptation always had. People solved problems, children grew, elders taught. But the same question, how to stay alive, was now being answered with slightly different instincts in different places. Those answers were still compatible, still human, but they were no longer identical. And when the world stops rewarding the same instincts everywhere, even small differences repeated long enough begin to carry weight that no one notices until it has already settled in. That weight, once settled, began shaping expectation before thought had time to intervene. What people prepared for felt obvious. What they ignored felt safe. Over time, response hardened into habit, and habit quietly rewired judgment. In places where loss arrived slowly but lasted long, patience came to feel responsible. Waiting reduced exposure. In places where change arrived suddenly and punished hesitation, speed felt protective. Acting together reduced danger. Waiting felt like waste. Neither instinct was chosen. Each survived because it reduced harm more often than it caused it. Contact between groups could no longer smooth these differences away. Encounters still happened, but they were brief and shallow, not deep enough to replace habits shaped by years of repetition. What worked somewhere else often failed here, and failure carried consequences people could not afford. Curiosity yielded to caution. Familiar solutions felt safer than imported ones. Even when those imports were effective under different conditions, reliability became valuable in itself because reliability reduced fear. Children absorbed this logic without being taught. They learned what kind of risk was acceptable by watching which mistakes adults corrected gently and which they reacted to immediately. They learned how much cooperation was necessary by noticing when acting alone caused harm. Over time, these lessons formed an internal sense of how the world behaved. Once that sense settled in, alternatives felt wrong, not because they were immoral, but because they violated expectation. The shared adaptability that once allowed rapid blending weakened quietly, not because people lost the ability to learn, but because learning now carried cost. Adopting a new habit meant abandoning one that had already proven safe. Safety once earned is difficult to surrender. Stability felt protective even when it limited possibility. The land had taught people what to trust, and trust narrowed attention. From the inside, life still felt continuous. People did not feel themselves changing, they felt themselves responding. Parents passed on what had worked. Elders taught what had kept them alive. No one sensed a boundary forming. Yet, the invisible frame through which problems were interpreted was no longer shared across distance. The same question, how to survive, was now answered with instincts that no longer aligned perfectly. If groups had been forced back together, blending could have happened, but the conditions that once encouraged constant contact were gone. Distance, friction, and repetition had replaced them. The world was no longer smoothing humanity into a single rhythm. It was allowing multiple rhythms to persist side by side. By the time this phase settled, humanity had crossed an unseen threshold, not into identities or cultures, but into trajectory, paths shaped by environment, reinforced by habit, and protected by instinct. The shared origin remained, but it no longer guided daily life. What guided life now was what the land rewarded, again and again. And once survival consistently rewards different instincts. The future stops unfolding as a single story. Even though the past once was dot, and even though nothing felt broken, distance had begun doing quiet work that no decision ever announced. Routes that once overlapped now pulled apart. Returns became less likely. Familiar paths were reused, while unfamiliar ones faded from memory. Movement still happened, but it followed narrower corridors, shaped by safety rather than curiosity. Over time, this meant that groups stopped carrying the same range of experience. What one group learned through repeated exposure, another never encountered at all. As familiarity narrowed, environments began demanding commitment rather than motion. Some places offered enough reliability that returning again and again made more sense than continuing outward. Certain riverbanks fed people often enough to be trusted. Certain valleys softened risk just enough to reduce constant movement. Staying near what worked felt less dangerous than searching for something better that might not exist. This was not ownership, it was gravity. The land pulled people back because it answered their needs more consistently than anywhere else. Once return became routine, change followed naturally. People noticed patterns not because they were looking for them, but because they stayed long enough for patterns to repeat. Plants returned to the same places, animals followed predictable routes, seasons left traces that could be remembered. Small actions taken early sometimes changed outcomes later. Clearing an area improved regrowth, protecting certain plants increased yield. These were not plans, they were observations acted on because the same place was seen again. This shift introduced delay into survival. Effort spent now mattered later, and once delay matters, planning can no longer be avoided. In some environments that planning could be managed within a household, timing was narrow, labor was concentrated, storage mattered more than coordination. In other environments, delay demanded collective effort. Water had to be managed together. Fields depended on shared timing. No single group could control not just on effort but on synchronization. As this happened, movement slowed further. Leaving meant abandoning effort already invested. Returning made sense because the future now depended on the past. The world no longer rewarded constant flexibility everywhere. In some places, once rewarded consistency instead. And consistency, once rewarded, reshapes behavior quickly. Children born into this phase experience stability differently. They grew up watching adults invest effort into places rather than routes. They learned that some actions mattered because of what they produced later, not immediately. They learned to wait for outcomes tied to seasons rather than events. These lessons changed how time itself was felt. The present was no longer everything. The near future gained weight. This did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not happen the same way everywhere, but wherever the land allowed reliability, commitment followed, and wherever commitment followed, habits hardened faster. The margin for experimentation shrank because failure now threatened stored effort and future return, not just the present moment. The familiar solutions gained value because they protected what had already been invested. None of this felt like transformation from the inside. People still adapted, they still responded to pressure, but adaptation was now filtered through places that mattered and routines that repeated. The shared human flexibility that once allowed rapid blending gave way to localized responses that no longer averaged out across distance. What had begun as quiet separation through movement now deepened through staying. Distance reduced contact, staying reduced variation. Together they locked experience into narrower channels. And once survival depends on repeating actions in the same places, those actions begin shaping not just behavior, but expectation. The future starts being imagined in familiar terms. Because unfamiliar terms now carry risk at that point, difference no longer needed isolation to persist. It had found stability and repetition. When tied to survival, does not remain neutral for long. It begins sorting behavior. What succeeds is repeated without discussion. What fails disappears without ceremony. Over time, this quiet filtering shapes habit more powerfully than instruction ever could. People stop testing the world broadly. Attention narrows, certain signals are noticed immediately, others are ignored entirely. The land teaches this selectivity patiently through consequence. In places where preparation protected against long absence, effort flowed toward storage and foresight. People learn to act early and then wait. They learn to reduce exposure by minimizing unnecessary movement. Risk was not eliminated. In places where change arrived quickly and unpredictably, preparation alone could not protect against loss. Waiting carried danger. People learned to read timing, to move together, to adjust rapidly when conditions shifted. Risk was managed through coordination rather than control. Neither approach was debated. Each survived because it reduced harm often enough. As these habits repeated, they began shaping how people related to one another. In environments where foresight mattered most, responsibility narrowed, success or failure often traced back to the household. Cooperation still existed, but dependence was selective, mattered most. Responsive is stilistivist, not as moral preference, but as practical alignment with what reduced danger. These differences remained subtle because nothing named them, no one explained them. They were learned through watching what happened when someone acted alone or too late or too early. Children absorbed this logic before they could articulate it. They learned what kind of mistake drew immediate response and what kind was tolerated. Over time, this formed an internal sense of how the world behaved and how people should behave within it. Contact between groups no longer corrected these tendencies. Encounters still happened, but they were not frequent or deep enough to replace habits reinforced daily. What worked elsewhere often failed here, and failure carried consequences that discouraged imitation. Curiosity gave way to caution. Solutions felt risky because they had not been tested against local punishment. Familiar methods gained authority simply by surviving. Language began reflecting this narrowing of experience. Words tied to local conditions grew vague or disappeared. Stories focused on familiar risks. Knowledge that no longer applied locally stopped being passed down. Memory became selective, not because people forgot, but because relevance crowded out everything else. Attention followed survival. By this point, difference no longer required distance to persist. It was embedded in routine. Habits shaped expectation. Expectation shaped judgment. Judgment filtered new information before it could challenge what already felt reliable. The shared human past still existed, but it no longer guided daily decisions. From the inside, life still felt ordinary. People did not experience themselves becoming different. Each generation inherited solutions that had worked and treated them as common sense. No one felt constrained, because constraint felt like safety, and safety once earned is rarely questioned. This is how separation deepens without anyone choosing it. Not through belief, not through identity, but through repetition that rewards some responses and quietly removes others. Over time, those rewards and removals shape not just behavior, but the range of futures people can imagine without fear. And when imagination narrows alongside habit, difference no longer drifts, it settles. And once it settles, it begins shaping more than action, it shapes assumption. People stop asking whether another way might work and start assuming it would not because they tested it and failed, but because it falls outside the logic that has kept them alive so far. What once felt like choice fades into expectation. The world is experienced not as a range of possibilities, but as a set of limits that feel natural and unquestionable. At this point, flexibility has not disappeared, but it has direction. Change is allowed only where it does not threaten what already feels stable. New tools are accepted if they fit existing routine. New ideas are tolerated if they reinforce familiar outcomes. Anything that challenges the underlying rhythm of survival feels dangerous. Even when no one can explain why, risk is no longer measured only by outcome, but by deviation. Children growing up inside these patterns inherit them as atmosphere rather than instruction. They learn what feels sensible by watching what adults do without hesitation and what they pause before doing. They learn which actions require discussion and which are automatic. Over time, this distinction becomes internal. Some behaviors feel obvious, others feel reckless. This feeling arrives long before reasoning ever does. As these assumptions pass from one generation to the next, they become harder to trace back to their origin. The land that shaped them is no longer consciously present in every decision, but its influence remains embedded. People no longer say they prepare because winters are harsh or coordinate, because water is unpredictable. They prepare and coordinate because that is what responsible people do, because turns into character. This is where misunderstanding becomes possible, even before contact increases. When people encounter others who respond differently to the same problem, the difference feels puzzling. Why wait when action is needed? Why act when patience seems safer? But confusion that cannot be resolved through shared experience eventually demands explanation. And explanation, without context, often turns difference into flaw. Isolation allows these explanations to deepen inward. Without frequent correction, local logic becomes self-confirming. Success proves it right. Failure is attributed to circumstance rather than structure. Over time, misproduces confidence that feels like certainty. Certainty reduces to confidence that feels like certainty. Curiosity fades because it no longer feels necessary. None of this requires hostility. No one needs to decide that another way is wrong. It is enough that one way feels safe. Safety, once established, resists challenge more strongly than belief ever could. Changing belief risks pride. Changing what keeps you alive risks. By the time this phase completes, humanity is not divided into cultures or civilizations yet, but it has lost something subtle. The instinctive sense that different solutions might be equally valid under different conditions has weakened. In its place grows an assumption that the familiar way is the sensible way, not universally correct, but correct enough to trust. This does not lock the future completely. Paths can still cross, learning can still happen, but the cost of real change has risen. To adapt now requires unlearning instincts that feel protective, and unlearning protection feels like stepping into danger. Difference no longer needs distance or isolation to survive. It now lives inside expectation, inside judgment, inside the quiet sense of what feels normal, and once normal hardens. Even small deviations feel like threats, not opportunities. That is the moment when separation stops being accidental and starts becoming durable, not because anyone chose it, but because the world trained people to stop questioning what had already worked. And that durability changed the meaning of movement itself. Traveling no longer felt like adjustment, it felt like risk. The farther people moved from what they understood, the more unpredictable outcomes became over time. This shifted behavior without announcement. Groups returned to the same places, not because they claimed them, but because leaving them felt dangerous. Certain riverbanks, valleys, and plains answered human effort often enough to earn trust, drafir, trust, drumpust. Return allowed memory to build, and memory, when tied to place, begins anchoring people in ways movement never does. Staying long enough revealed patterns that wandering could not. Seasons repeated, plants returned, animals followed routes that could be anticipated. Small actions taken early produced protecting certain plants increased yield. None of this was understood as a new way of life. It was simply noticed because people were present to notice it. The same place seen repeatedly teaches lessons that distance hides. These lessons introduced delay into survival. Effort now mattered across time, not just moments. What you did weeks earlier could determine whether food existed later. Delay forced planning, even where planning had once been fragile. In some environments, this planning fit naturally into household routine. Effort was concentrated, timing was narrow, storage reduced uncertainty. In others, delay demanded coordination beyond any single group. Water had to be managed collectively. Fields depended on shared timing. Survival shifted from individual foresight to one synchronized effort. As this happened, movement slowed further. Leaving meant abandoning work already invested. Returning made sense because the future now depended on the past. Flexibility narrowed because consistency was being rewarded. What had once been adaptation through motion became adaptation through repetition. People still adjusted, but adjustment now happened within places that mattered not. Across wide ranges, children born into this phase experienced the world differently from those before them. They grew up watching adults invest effort into the same locations year after year. They learned that some actions mattered because of what they produced later, not immediately. The present was no longer everything. The near future demanded attention. Waiting gained meaning because outcomes depended on it. This did not happen everywhere, and it did not happen the same way. Some lands punished staying, others rewarded it. Where reliability existed, commitment followed. Where commitment followed, experimentation narrowed because failure now threatened stored effort and future return, not just the current moment. Familiar methods gained authority simply because they protected what had already been built from the inside. This did not feel like transformation. People did not say they were changing how they lived. They said they were doing what worked. Parents taught children what had fed them. Elders passed down lessons that had proven safe. The shared human flexibility that once allowed rapid blending faded quietly, replaced by local responses, reinforced by the same pressures repeating on the same people. What had begun as separation, through movement now deepened, through staying, distance, reduced contact. Together they loved experience into narrower channels, and once survival depends on repeating actions in the same places, those actions begin shaping not just behavior, but expectation. A future starts being imagined in familiar terms, because unfamiliar terms now carry risk at that point. Difference no longer needed isolation to persist. It had found stability in place, and stability has a way of holding on. Once it takes hold, begins organizing life in ways that feel invisible to the people living inside it. Repetition turns useful actions into routine, and routines slowly harden into structure without anyone deciding they should. Tasks happen at expected times, so settle around who does what. Well, responsibility attaches itself to patterns that reduce uncertainty. What began as practical repetition becomes the background rhythm of daily life. In places where effort could be contained within a household, routine pulled inward, families organized their time around narrow windows of urgency. Success depended on whether enough had been prepared at the right moment. Failure was often personal, limited to one group rather than spreading outward. This encouraged clear boundaries of responsibility. Each household became its own unit of planning, storage, and accountability. Cooperation existed, but it was supportive rather than essential. In places where land and water demanded shared effort, routine pulled outward, timing mattered across many people at once, fields flooded or dried, depending on collective action channels needed maintenance. Delays by one group affected others, responsibility spread beyond kin, tempo became critical. Routine belonged to the group rather than the individual, and stability depended on synchronization. As these routines repeated, they began shaping how time itself was experienced. In inward-focused systems, time felt divided into moments that mattered intensely, and long periods that mattered very little. In outward-focused system, time felt continuous, cyclical. These differences influenced patience, urgency, and tolerance for delay. They shaped how people reacted to interruption and how they judged effort. Over generations, routine started filtering behavior before thought intervened. Certain actions felt normal, others felt disruptive. Children absorbed this without explanation, learning when to act and when to wait by watching patterns. They learned whom to rely on by noticing who consistently participated and who did not. Trust attached itself to reliability rather than intention. Once routines stabilized, they resisted disruption, not because anyone defended them consciously, but because many things now depended on them working as expected. Changing one part risked unsettling others. New tools were accepted if they fit existing rhythms. New methods survived only if they did not threaten coordination or stored effort. What had once been flexible adaptation became structured response. At this point, the environment was no longer shaping life directly. It was shaping life through systems people had built in response to it. Those systems filtered experience. They defined what felt reasonable and what felt dangerous. They shaped how people responded not just to land and season, but to one another from the inside. This still felt like common sense. People did not feel constrained. They felt organized. Stuli felt protective. Predictability reduced fear. And fear, once reduced, makes the structures that reduced it feel necessary, even when they quietly limit alternatives. Difference, now embedded in routine, no longer drifted or softened. It persisted not as identity, not as belief, but as structure that guided behavior day after day. And once structure takes hold, it does more than shape action. It prepares the ground for something heavier to settle on top of it. And what settled on top of that structure was order, not imposed from above, but drawn upward by necessity. Once routine governed survival, coordination stopped being optional. Someone had to decide when shared work began. Someone had to resolve disputes over timing, access, or effort. At first, these roles were temporary, filled by whoever had experience or clarity in the moment, but repetition changes roles just as it changes behavior. When the same problems return, the same solutions are reused, and when the same people solve them repeatedly, expectation forms around them. In inward-focused systems, order gathered around control of accumulated effort. Store food, land that had been cleared, tools refined through repetition. These became points of gravity. Influence followed those who managed surplus well, because surplus reduced fear for others during scarcity. Authority did not arrive as command, it arrived as reliance. Decisions clustered around those whose preparation had already proven reliable. Over time, what began as trust turned into expectation. Expectation turned into authority that no longer faded when conditions changed. In outward-focused systems, order gathered around coordination itself. No single household could protect stability alone, so influence flowed toward those who could organize participation. Those who ensured cooperation reduced risk for everyone. As coordination expanded, these roles became continuous. What began as situational leadership turned into ongoing oversight. Order spread outward, binding people together through shared obligation rather than individual control. Decisions that had once been negotiated case by case were now expected to follow precedent. When conflict arose, people looked to establish roles for resolution, not because those roles were sacred, but because they had worked predictability, reduced uncertainty. Systems that reduced uncertainty gained legitimacy. They saw it already in place. They learned who decided, who coordinated, and who followed by observation, not instruction, over time. Obedience stopped feeling like submission and began feeling like normal behavior, not because people were passive, but because deviation now carried risk beyond the individual. A disrupted routine threatened shared effort. At this point, order began shaping social relationships more deeply. Trust followed structure. In systems centered on accumulated resources, trust narrowed, dependence was selective, obligations were often defined by exchange and kinship. In systems centered on coordination, trust spread wider, but became conditional on participants. Failure to align with collective rhythm carried consequences, not as punishment, but as exposure to risk. Once order stabilized, it resisted change quietly, not through force, but through dependency. Many activities now relied on routine functioning as expected. Altering them threatened more than comfort. It threatened continuity. What fit survived, what disrupted coordination or threatened stored effort was treated cautiously or ignored. Stability gained value in itself. The environment still mattered, but its influence was now mediated through systems. People had built land and season-shaped outcomes, indirectly, filtered by routines and roles that organized response. They shaped how people responded not just to nature, but to one another. From the inside, this did not feel like loss, it felt like order. Chaos was something remembered vaguely or imagined, not experienced daily. Structure reduced fear. Reduced fear made structure feel necessary, and once order feels necessary, it becomes difficult to imagine life without it. By this point, humanity had crossed another quiet threshold. Survival was no longer organized only by environment or habit. It was organized by order, and order, once established, carries momentum. It persists even when conditions shift. It rewards familiarity. It penalizes deviation. It shapes the future not through intention but through inertia. Difference, now carried by order itself, no longer drifted or softened. It was held in place, ready to be amplified when growth began pressing against the limits of what these early systems could contain. And as growth began pressing against those limits, order responded the only way it could, by expanding rather than dissolving. Surplus accumulated more reliably than before, not evenly, but enough to change the rhythm of daily survival. When food could be counted weeks or months ahead, not everyone needed to spend every day securing it. Some people stayed closer to stores and tools, others focused on making those tools better, others watched routes, mediated disputes, or guarded what had been gathered. Specialization did not arrive as progress, it arrived as relief. Fewer urgent tasks meant fewer immediate risks, and fewer risks made complexity possible. With complexity came density. People clustered near places that could support repeated effort. As more lives depended on the same stores and routine, mistakes carried heavier consequences. A failed harvest now threatened many mouths. A broken coordination disrupted weeks of labor. The cost of disorder rose sharply, and with it came pressure to prevent it before it appeared. Rules began emerging not as laws, but as habits enforced more consistently. Certain actions were encouraged because they protected stability. Others were discouraged because they introduced uncertainty. These preferences did not feel imposed. They felt obvious. The system was simply doing what reduced danger. Over time, encouragement hardened into expectation. What had once been flexible response became regulated behavior, not through ideology, but through consequence repeated often enough to feel natural. How this regulation took shape depended on what kind of order already existed. Where coordination across many people had always been essential, expansion strengthened central oversight. Managing shared water, someone had to track effort beyond memory. Someone had to ensure participation did not lapse. Authority deepened, not because it was desired, but because coordination could not survive without it. Oversight became permanent, so it's multiplied. Decisions flowed through fewer channels because fewer channels reduced risk. Where order had grown around households and accumulated effort, many centers grew at once. Community traded, competed, merged, and fractured. Leadership rose and fell more frequently. Authority was still real, but it was often contested. The system tolerated rivalry because failure threatened all others. Stability existed, but it was distributed rather than concentrated. As systems expanded, protection became inseparable from production. Store food attracted theft, fixed land invited claims, routes became assets worth controlling, defense shifted from reaction to planning, barriers appeared, watchers appeared, agreements hardened, not because people became more violent, but because vulnerability now threatened accumulated effort built over years. Losing what had been stored or coordinated meant losing time, not just food, and time once invested became something worth guarding. Trust changed again under this pressure. In small groups, trust had been personal. In structured systems, trust became procedural. You no longer needed to know someone well to depend on them. You needed to know their role. Symbols, records, and routine replaced familiarity. It also reduced tolerance for deviation. When systems grow large, reliability matters more than intention. Memory once carried entirely in people began needy reinforcement. Agreements outlasted individuals. Obligations extended beyond immediate presence. Counting mattered. Tracking mattered. Early record keeping emerged not as culture, but as survival support. Structure demanded continuity, and continuity demanded tools that could outlast a single lifetime. As these mechanisms settled in systems gained inertia, they continued functioning even when conditions shifted slightly because too much depended on them working as expected. Changing them felt risky, not morally, but practically. New methods were adopted only if they fit existing structure. What threatened coordination or stored effort was filtered out not through resistance, but through consequence. From the inside, this still felt like order doing its job. People did not experience expansion as loss of freedom. They experienced it as increased stability. Predictability reduced fear. Reduced fear made structure feel necessary. The environmental pressures that had originally shaped these systems faded from memory, but their effects remained embedded in daily life. As growth continued, the differences between systems stopped being subtle. What had once been small variations in habit and coordination, not because anyone chose divergence, but because scaling amplified what was already there. Swing built to solve local problems carried those solutions forward, shaping everything that grew on top of them. At that point, separation no longer depended on distance or isolation. It lived inside systems themselves. And systems, once heavy enough to sustain thousands of lives, do not change direction easily. And once systems reached that weight, something else settled in quietly alongside them. Power stopped being temporary in earlier phases. Influence rose and fell with circumstance. Someone led because they solved a problem, because they had experience, because conditions demanded it. When the moment passed, authority faded. But in large, stable systems, moments overlap. Storch must be managed year after year. Rules must apply even when nothing is visibly wrong. And when responsibility becomes continuous, authority follows it. Power began attaching itself to position rather than moment. Not because people suddenly desired domination, but because systems require permanence to function. Someone had to oversee surveillance. Someone had to maintain routine that outlived individual memory. Someone had to enforce expectations even when conditions felt calm. Over time, these roles detached from the people who first filled them and became offices that others could step into. Authority stopped feeling situational and began feeling structural in systems built around large-scale coordination. When thousands depended on shared infrastructure, interruptions were costly. A lapse in water management or labor timing threatened everyone at once. Stability became the highest priority. Oversaw expanded procedures. Multiplied, decisions narrowed into fewer channels. Because fewer channels reduced uncertainty, centralization did not arrive as ideology. In systems that had grown from household-centered order, power also stabilized. But along different lines, authority remained more contested. Leadership changed hands more often. Alliances formed and dissolved. Competition stayed visible. Yet even here, permanence took root. Control of land, trade routes, or surplus created leverage that could be passed on. What changed was not whether power stayed, but how predictably it did. As power settled, distance grew between decision and consequence. Those who enforced rules were no longer always the ones who felt their immediate effects. This separation was not malicious, it was structural. In large systems, no one can experience the whole directly. Abstraction becomes necessary. Decisions rely on records, reports, and expectations rather than shared presence. Power becomes less personal and more procedural. Procedure brings justification. Rules must be explained. Authority must be framed as legitimate. At first, legitimacy comes from function. A system works. People are fed. Order is maintained. Over time, explanation shifts. What worked becomes tradition. Expectation becomes something that feels self-evident. Power no longer needs to prove itself every day it is assumed. This assumption reshapes social life. Obedience begins to feel normal, not because people are constantly coerced, but because deviation now carries systemic cost. Breaking a rule does not just affect one interaction, it threatens coordination. And uncertainty is precisely what these systems evolved to eliminate. Predictability is rewarded. Variation is tolerated only when it does not destabilize the whole. These pressures reach inward, shaping how people think before they speak. Certain questions feel safe, others feel dangerous without anyone needing to say why. Change is acceptable. Change that challenges the structure itself feels reckless. People learn this through consequence, not instruction. Those who align advance, those who resist stall or disappear from influence. None of this requires belief in superiority or destiny. Systems do not need ideology to persist. They need repetition and alignment between survival and compliance. When following the system keeps food coming and conflict low, loyalty forms without persuasion. People defend what organizes their lives because losing it feels like losing ground beneath their feet. As power stabilizes, it begins shaping responses to stress. In centralized system, stress tightens control. Over, say, inconsist, coordination intensifies. In more fragmented system, stress sharpens. Competition. Both reactions follow existing structure. Neither is freely chosen. Each feels like the safest response available. At this point, difference no longer lies only in environment or routine. It lies in how power stays, how it responds to threat. and how it justifies itself over time. These patterns will shape everything that follows. Law, conflict, expansion. The land set the conditions. Order organized behavior. Growth gave it weight, and power, once anchored, learned how to remain. And as power learned how to remain, it began shaping more than behavior. It began shaping perception. People did not just follow systems anymore. They started seeing the world through them. What had once been external structure slowly moved inward, becoming the lens through which order, risk, and change were understood. Authority no longer needed constant enforcement because it had been absorbed into expectation. This shift happened without announcement. No one decided to think differently. Thought changed because certain ways of thinking were rewarded while others quietly disappeared. Over time, people learned which questions maintained stability and which ones unsettled it. They learned which explanations felt acceptable and which felt dangerous, often without being able to say why. This learning was not ideological. At first, it was practical, but practicality repeated long enough becomes belief in systems where coordination and continuity were essential. Order felt protective, disruption felt threatening, even when it promised improvement. Change was filtered carefully, often slowed by layers of approval and precedent. Respect for hierarchy did not feel like obedience, it felt like caution. When many lives depend on a system functioning smoothly, deviation carries weight far beyond the individual. Thought adapts to avoid that weight. In systems where power remained more contested, thinking moved differently. Instability was familiar, authority was expected to be challenged. Change felt less catastrophic because no single structure held everything together. Competition became a normal condition rather than a failure of order. New ideas emerged through rivalry and pressure rather than consensus. Risk felt tolerable. Again, war. This was not preference. It was alignment with how survival had been organized. Across generations, these patterns left traces in language, story, and moral intuition. Some societies told stories that emphasized balance, continuity, and proper alignment within an existing order. Others emphasized struggle, disruption, and transformation. They explained them after the fact, giving meaning to lies already shaped by structure. Values followed the same path. Traits that reduced friction were praised, traits that increased it were discouraged. Patience, restraint, and conformity felt virtuous where coordination mattered most. Independence, assertion, and challenge felt virtuous where competition drove adaptation. These values felt moral, but they were rooted in practicality. They described what kind of person functioned well inside a given system. Over time, this produced an illusion of nature. Later generation inherited conclusions without seeing the process that created them. Authority felt inevitable. Hierarchy felt obvious. Certain behaviors felt right without explanation. When people looked outward and saw others living differently, the difference felt deeper than structure. It felt like character, like nature, like destiny. Institutions reinforced this perception by preserving their own logic. History was remembered selectively. Continuity was emphasized. Existing order was framed as wisdom rather than circumstance. Questioning foundational assumption introduced instability, and instability was precisely what these systems were designed to prevent. At this stage, divergence moved beyond habit and routine. It entered identity, not as a label, but as expectation. People expected authority to behave a certain way. They expected change to arrive through specific channels. When those expectations were violated, discomfort followed, then resistance, then conflict. Yet none of this required intention. No one set out to shape thought power, did it simply by staying. Stable systems shape incentives, shape behavior. Behavior shapes expectation. Expectation shapes. This is why later explanations for difference often miss the point. People search for causes in intelligence, morality, or culture because structure is invisible to those living inside it. It feels like the background of reality itself, but structure is where difference is preserved, transmitted, and amplified across generations. By the time this phase settled, societies were no longer just organized differently. They thought differently about order, authority, risk, and change. These differences were not absolute. Individuals could still adapt, ideas could still travel. But the baseline had shifted. Each system now carried a default setting, and defaults guide reaction before reflection. What followed would make these differences impossible to ignore. Contact would increase, trade would widen, conflict would scale, and systems shaped by different assumptions would begin pressing directly against one another, not as distant variations, but as competing ways of organizing the world. And when those ways of organizing the world finally met again, they did not meet as variations of the same experiment. They met as systems with memory, momentum, and confidence in their own logic. Contact no longer felt neutral. Encounters that once would have been simple exchanges now carried tension because each side arrived with assumptions already settled. The same action could signal trust to one system and threat to another. Misunderstanding appeared before hostility ever did. Trade was usually the first point of sustained contact. Goods traveled more easily than ideas. Metals, crops, tools, and animals crossed distances long before the structures that produced them were fully understood. At first, exchange was practical. One place had what another lacked. But trade exposes more than material difference. It reveals how agreements are made, how obligations are enforced, how trust is extended or withdrawn. Systems recognize each other through these details, often unconsciously. Where authority was centralized and procedures were stable, exchange tended to be regulated. Predictability mattered more than speed. Traders were expected to fit into existing channels rather than reshape them. Where authority remained, fragment exchange stayed flexible, negotiation was personal, alliances shifted. Competition between routes and partners was common. Each approach felt normal to the system, using it, and suspicious to the one encountering it. What one side experienced as order, the other experienced as rigidity. What one side experienced as adaptability, the other experienced as unreliability. Each interpreted the other through its own assumptions, rarely questioning those assumptions themselves. Intent was misread. Caution was mistaken for deceit. Flexibility was mistaken for weakness. They were reflexive, produced by systems that had learned to protect themselves in different ways. Conflict followed when interests overlapped more directly. Routes crossed, resource became shared. Expansion pressed against boundaries that had once been vague. Negotiation did not always fail, but when it did, force filled the gap. Even then, conflict reflected underlying structure. Systems built around coordination mobilized large, synchronized responses. Systems built around competition relied on shifting alliances and local in ways that felt obvious to them and confusing to the other. Early conflicts were rarely decisive. They flared, subsided, and were often forgotten, but they mattered because they reinforced internal logic. Victory confirmed that the system worked. Defeat encouraged refinement rather than abandonment. Rarely did a society discard its structure after losing. Instead, it doubled down on what it already knew, adjusting tactics without questioning foundations. Weapons could be copied. Organization could not be transplanted so easily as encounters repeated. Stories began to form, not careful analysis. One system came to be associated with control, another with chaos. These labels were not accurate, but they were useful. They reduced complexity into character, and once character replaces structure in explanation, misunderstanding hardens. People stop asking how a system works and start assuming why it behaves the way it does. Boundaries began to sharpen under this pressure. What had once been fluid zones of interaction turned into borders that mattered. Not just physical borders, but conceptual ones. Inside and outside gained meaning. Loyalty was defined. Belonging became explicit. Neutrality grew difficult. Systems demanded alignment not only in action, but in expectation. To live within a system now meant learning across systems did not stop, but it slowed. Borrowing became selective. Texts were adopted without adopting the assumptions that made them effective. Superficial similarities masked deep differences. When these adaptations failed, failure reinforced suspicion rather than understanding. By this point, difference no longer drifted passively. It was being actively maintained. Each interaction tested systems against one another, and each test tended to strengthen existing patterns. Success reinforced confidence, friction reinforced caution. The cost of deep change rose because changing structure now threatened stability. Humanity had entered a new phase. Difference was no longer inherited only from land or habit. It was protected by systems aware of themselves. Contact no longer blended. It compared, judged, and pressured, and as these pressures accumulated, they prepared the ground for something larger than exchange or skirmish. What followed would not simply be more contact, it would be escalation, at scale, power, expanding outward, systems colliding, not at their edges but at their cores. And when that happened, the quiet differences shaped over thousands of years would begin determining which paths stayed open and which ones closed. For good. Escalon changed the role of conflict itself. It stopped being an interruption and became a condition that societies planned around. Preparation for war began shaping how resources were gathered, how authority justified itself, and how populations were organized long before fighting actually started. Conflict did not invent these systems, but it tested them repeatedly, forcing adaptation to happen faster and under pressure that left little room for doubt. In systems built on centralized sedation, repeated conflict pushed consolidation. Further, large populations could be mobilized through existing channels. Resource could be redirected with limited negation. This made sustained campaigns possible, but it also raised the cost of failure. Losing a conflict threatened not just leaders, but the stability of the entire system. As a result, risk was managed carefully. Expansion tended to be deliberate. Territory was absorbed and administered rather than simply seized. Order followed force, because order was already how survival had been organized. In systems shaped by competition and fragmented authority, conflict accelerated a different pattern. War was frequent but rarely final. Alliances shifted. Victories were temporary. Defeats were survivable. No single loss ended the system because no single center held everything together. Pressure encouraged experimente. This produced resilience of a different kind, not through stability but through recovery. The system learned by being stressed repeatedly rather than by preventing stress. These contrasting responses reshaped how strength was understood. In centralized systems, strength meant endurance, the ability to absorb shock without collapsing. Stability itself became proof of power. In fragmented systems, strength meant adaptability, the ability to reorganize and return after disruption. Survival through instability became its own form of success. Each definition made sense inside its own structure, and each failed when applied to the other. Military organization fed back into civilian life, sit back into civilian life. Obedience during war translated into obedience during peace. Hierarchies hardened. Zorts became clearer. Systems that relied on initiative and competition carried those traits beyond the battlefield. Authority was expected to be challenged. Conflict did not stay contained. It trained societies to behave in particular ways. Even when fighting stopped, technology did not erase these differences. It amplified them. New weapons spread unevenly, not because some societies lacked intelligence, but because each system integrated tools according to its own logic. Centralized systems emphasized standardization. Immutable systems emphasized variation, rapid modification, and local adaptation. Victories were explained as confirmation of internal virtue. Defeats were framed as temporary setbacks caused by circumstance rather than structure. History was remembered selectively, narratives formed that justified authority and explained hierarchy. These stories were not created to deceive, they helped systems maintain coherence and brought pressure. Misunderstanding deepened alongside these narratives. Each system viewed the other's strengths as threats and the other's weaknesses as proof of inferiority. Centralized systems saw fragmentation as instability. Fragmented systems saw centralization as oppression. Neither interpretation captured the full reality. Each reflected the assumptions built into the system, doing the judging. Boundaries hardened further under constant pressure. What had once been zones of exchange became lines of defense, loyalty became explicit, belonging mattered, neutrality grew difficult, systems demanded commitment not only in action but in expectation. To question the system now felt like weakening it in front of rivals. Conformity gained value because unity reduced vulnerability. Learning across systems. Borrowing continued, but it was selective and shallow. Texts were adopted without adopting the underlying structure that made them effective. When these borrowed elements failed, failure reinforced suspicion rather than curiosity. The conclusion was rarely that the systems were incompatible, it was that the other way was flawed. By this stage, difference was no longer drifting. It was accelerating. Conflict created feedback loops that reinforced existing patterns. Each confrontation confirmed what each system already believed about itself and the other. The cost of fundamental change rose sharply, because changing structure now meant risking survival. In a hostile environment, most societies chose refinement over transformation. The same structures kept reproducing themselves. New rulers inherited old systems. New ideology adapted to existing frameworks. Even revolutions often preserved the logic they claimed to reject. The architecture of survival proved stubborn, escaping not just who won or lost, but which futures were possible at all. Others turned inward protectively, trade expanded unevenly, knowledge circulated along constrained paths, and the differences that had begun as quiet responses to land and survival now carried enough momentum to steer entire regions through history in different directions, long before anyone thought of them as east or west. With that momentum in place, difference stopped being something that appeared only at moments of contact. It became something that shaped the direction societies moved even when no one else was present. Systems no longer waited for conflict to define them. They carried its lessons forward into peace, into planning, into how future generations were prepared to face the world. In environments where endurance and coordination had proven decisive, stability became the highest virtue. Long continuity was valued more than rapid change. Institutions were preserved because they had survived pressure before the authority drew disruption without collapse. Demonation was not rejected, but it was absorbed carefully. Change was safest when it strengthened continuity rather than challenging it. Over time, this produced societies that could last for centuries with recognizable structure, adapting slowly while maintaining internal coherence. In environments where adaptability and competition had proven decisive, disruption felt less threatening. Systems recover from it. Authority was provisional. Swing were adjusted frequently. Innovation spread through rivalry rather than consensus. Change did not need to justify itself through continuity. It justified itself through results. This produced societies that fractured and reformed repeatedly, but also experimented constantly. Progress came unevenly, but pressure ensured that stagnation rarely lasted long. When new routes opened, some systems moved to regulate them, integrating them into existing structures. Others moved to compete over them, allowing multiple approaches to coexist until one proved dominant. When new knowledge appeared, some systems filtered it through tradition. Others tested it aggressively. Neither response was inherently superior. Each reflected a history of what had kept the system alive under pressure. Over time, these differences accumulated into asymmetry, not because one side advanced while the other stood still, but because they advanced in different ways, at different speeds, and toward different priority. Stimuli produced depth. Competition produced acceleration. Coordination produced scale. Each advantage came with limits that only became visible much later. What makes this divergence difficult to see is that it never announces itself as division. People living inside these systems experience them as normal. The assumptions feel obvious. The risks feel real. The alternatives feel dangerous or impractical. When they look outward and see others behaving differently, the explanation that comes easiest is not structure, but character, intelligence, discipline, freedom. destiny. These stories are simpler than tracing thousands of years of constraint and adaptation by this point. The past no longer feels shared. The same species that once moved as a single adaptive unit now carries different expectations about authority, change, cooperation, and risk. These expectations guide decision before reflection. They shape which futures feel possible and which feel unthinkable. And because they are embedded in systems rather than beliefs, they persist even when beliefs change. This is the quiet outcome of everything that came before. Land shaped survival, survival shaped habit, habit hardened into structure, structure scaled into power, power trained thought, conflict accelerated difference, and difference, once accelerated long enough, began steering history itself. From here on, events will look dramatic. Wealth will concentrate and disperse. Some regions will appear to surge ahead while others seem to pause. But those outcomes will not begin where they appear to begin. They will be expressions of momentum already built. The world will eventually give these regions names: East, West, Europe, Asia. But by the time those names exist, the separation they describe will already be old, not written into blood or intelligence, but into systems that learn to survive in different ways, and then taught their children to trust those ways without remembering why what remains is not a mystery of who was better or smarter. It is a record of how small differences, protected long enough by habit, structure, and power, can grow heavy enough to bend the future in different directions, even when everything begins from the same human beginning. Once history began bending under that accumulated weight, the effects appeared first in places where movement, exchange, and pressure concentrated most intensely. Long-distance trade routes stretched farther than before. Linking systems that had grown apart for thousands of years, goods moved faster, ideas followed more slowly, and when ideas arrived without the structures that had produced them, they behaved unpredictably in regions where continuity and coordination had long protected stability. New tools were evaluation not only for usefulness but for how they would affect existing balance. Knowledge was filtered through institutions that had been built to preserve order. What fit was absorbed and standardized. What disrupted rhythm was delayed, reshaped, or quietly set aside. Progress felt safest when it strengthened what already worked, rather than introducing unfamiliar volatility. In regions where competition and fragmentation had shaped survival, outside influence triggered a different response. New techniques were tested quickly, often unevenly. Rival groups adopted, modified, or discarded ideas in parallel. Failure was expected and toleration. Success spread rapidly, because systems were unified. Pressure rewarded speed more than consistency. These contrasting responses shaped how society interacted with expanding networks. Some became hubs of regulation, stabilizing flows of goods. Others became fields of experimentation, where variation produced rapid change but also frequent collapse. Trade did not equalize these differences. The same exchange could reinforce continuity in one system and provoke disruption in another. As contact intensified, comparison became unavoidable. People began noticing not just that others lived differently, but that those differences produced different outcomes. Others appeared volatile, but dynamic. These appearances hardened into judgment. Order was confused to wisdom. Change was confused with chaos. The deeper causes remained invisible because they were structural rather than intentional. This period planted the seeds of later misunderstanding. When societies compared themselves, they compared results, not processes. They attributed success or failure to character instead of constraint. Disciplinings sassassaway to carry morality. They required no examination of the long chains of necessity that had shaped each system's behavior. Pressure continued building as populations grew and resources tightened. Systems responded in familiar ways. Those oriented toward continuity doubled down on regulation, seeking to preserve balance in the face of strain. Those oriented toward competition pushed outward. Each response made sense internally, each deepened difference externally. At the same time, the cost of reversal grew higher. To change direction now meant undoing layers of structure built over centuries. Institutions resisted not out of stubbornness, but because too many lives depended on them functioning predictably, even when leaders recognized limits. Altering the system threatened collapse. Momentum carried societies forward along paths laid down long before anyone was aware they existed. From the inside, this still felt like necessity. People did not experience themselves as choosing different futures. They experienced themselves as responding to pressure, using the tools they trusted. The idea that other responses might work elsewhere did little to change that trust. Familiar systems had survived too much to be questioned easily. This is how divergence enters the modern world without ever being declared. Not as a sudden split, but as inherited momentum. Regions move forward carrying different expectations about authority, innovation, and risk. When crises arrive, those expectations shape response before analysis ever begins. Some systems absorb shock by tightening, others by fragmenting and reforming. The outcomes look intentional, they rarely are. By the time global interaction becomes constant, the gap is no longer about who knows more. It is about what each system is prepared to do under pressure, what kinds of change feel possible, what kinds feel intolerable. These limits were not chosen at the moment they matter. They were trained in long stretches of survival when no one imagined they would one day shape the fate of continents. And so the story enters its final phase, not with a clean divide, but with a world already leaning in different directions, carrying the quiet momentum of decisions that were never meant to matter beyond the next season, but ended up shaping everything that followed. And that momentum revealed itself most clearly when strain arrived faster than systems could gradually absorb it. Epidemics, climate shifts, sudden population growth, and unexpected encounters acted like stress tests, exposing what each structure could bend without breaking. In systems built around continuity and coordination, the response leaned toward containment, rules tightened. Stability was protected even when it required sacrifice. Survival depended on preserving the whole, even if parts suffered. In systems shaped by competition and adaptation, strain triggered dispersion, groups split, new approaches were tried simultaneously. Loss in one place did not halt response elsewhere. Survival depended on finding alternates. These reactions shaped long-term outcomes in subtle ways. Containment preserved order, but it also slowed correction when the underlying structure itself caused harm. Adaptation allowed rapid change, but it also multiplied instability and loss. Neither response was ideal. Each reflected what the system trusted most. When pressure rose, as crises repeated, learning followed familiar channels. In continuity-focused systems, knowledge was preserved carefully, filtered through institutions that vowed, was refined and transmitted with minimal variation. Depth accumulated, memory extended across generation. In adaptation first, some vanished quickly, others transmove emulation. Some vanished quickly, others tran evenly but widely. Memory fractured, but innovation accelerated. Contact between systems during these periods often intensified understanding. Each side judged the other by outcomes seen during crisis. Preservation looked like stagnation. Experimentation looked like chaos. Neither judgment captured the trade-offs involved, but ignored the fact that each response was constrained by what the system could safely attempt without collapsing itself. As global networks tightened, these differences became harder to ignore. Technologies moved faster than institutions could adapt to them. Tools designed for one structure entered another without the habits that made them safe or effective. Where systems could absorb change by standardizing it, disruption was muted. Where systems relied on rapid testing, disruption spread widely before settling. The same invention produced stability in one place and upheaval in another. Over time, this created uneven acceleration, not because intelligence differed, but because tolerance for disruption differed. Systems trained to resilience, but sacrificing speed. Systems trained to endure disruption. Each path produced strengths that later appeared as advantages and weaknesses that later appeared as failures. From the inside, these outcomes still felt inevitable. People experienced success or decline as confirmation of what they already believed about order and change. When things worked, the system was praised. When things failed, the response was to reinforce familiar controls or familiar competition, not to question the underlying logic that shaped response in the first place. Momentum deepened by now. Difference no longer needed explanation. It felt self-evident. Ways of organizing life seemed naturally suited or unsuited to progress. These judgments were mistaken, but they were powerful. They guided policy, education, and ambition. They shaped which risks societies were willing to take and which they avoided at all costs. This is where modern divergence takes shape, not as a gap in knowledge, but as a gap in tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty, tolerance for loss, tolerance for restructuring. Systems that could absorb disruption continued pushing outward, reshaping themselves repeatedly. Systems that protected continuity continued deepening inward, refining what already existed. Neither stood still. They moved in different directions under the same pressures. What followed would make these differences visible on a global scale: expansion, colonization, industrialization. But those events would only accelerate trajectory already in motion. The deeper cause lay in how each system had learned to survive strain long before modernity arrived. And as the world moved toward constant interaction, those inherited responses would determine who adapted quickly, who resisted change, and who paid the highest price when adaptation came too late or too violently to control. By the time those pressures converged into what we now recognize as the modern world, the divergence no longer needed reinforcement from isolation or accident. It was self-sustaining. Systems carried their own momentum forward, shaping how societies interpreted opportunity, threat, and change before any conscious choice was made. What looked like decision was often reaction. What looked like intention. As industrialization accelerated these differences, it did not create new directions so much as intensify existing ones. Where systems were already accustomed to disruption, rapid reorganization felt survivable. Old structures could be dismantled and rebuilt because instability was familiar, loss was expected. Where systems were oriented toward continuity, industrial change felt dangerous at its core. It threatened rhythms that had preserved order for centuries. Adjustment happened, but it was filtered, carefully paced to avoid collapse. The same machines, the same techniques entered societies prepared to absorb them in very different ways. Expansion favored systems willing to gamble on disruption. Exploration, extraction, and experimentation carried enormous risk, but they also carried momentum. Other systems, valuing internal stability, resisted expansivity. It was preservation, but preservation, lipiteration. As global hierarchies formed, explanation followed outcome rather than cause. Success was attributed to superiority, failure to deficiency. Intelligence, culture, morality, ambition. These became convenient narratives because they were simple and flattering. They obscured the quieter truth that systems had been trained to respond differently. The modern gap was not born in factories or fleets. It emerged from centuries of learned response to pressure. Inside each society, these narratives reinforced existing momentum. Victors saw confirmation of their methods. The disadvantaged saw reason to defend or double down on familiar structures. Adaptation became harder because it now threatened identity as well as stability. Changing course meant admitting that what had preserved order might now limit possibility. Few systems can do that without crisis. By this stage, difference had fully entered self-reinforcement. Education trained people to think in ways compatible with existing systems. Institutions reward behaviors that sustain momentum. Innovation followed channels already shaped by history. Even revolutions often replaced leaders without replacing the deeper logic guiding response. What makes this divergence enduring is not power itself, but habit scaled across generations. Children grew up learning what risk looked like before they learned history. They learned what kind of change felt safe before they learned why. By the time they encountered other ways of organizing life, their instincts were already trained. Understanding required effort. Judgment arrived automatically. This is why convergence has always been difficult. Knowledge can travel quickly, technology can spread, but instinct moves slowly. Systems cannot simply adopt another system's responses. The unlearning feels dangerous even when conditions have changed. Survival memory lingers long after the threat has passed. In the end, the difference between regions that once shared the same human beginning was not written into biology or intellect. It was written into systems that learned to survive under different constraints, then taught those lessons so thoroughly that they became invisible. What followed looked like destiny only because the path had been walked for so long that turning back felt impossible. The world eventually named these paths. It drew borders. It told stories about East and West, tradition and progress, stability and freedom. But those names arrived after the fact, long before they existed. Humanity had already learned different ways of trusting order, embracing change, and facing uncertainty. And once those lessons are learned deeply enough, they do not disappear when the world changes. They continue guiding response, shaping possibility, and bending history forward, quietly, long after the conditions that taught them have been forgotten. That quiet guidance is why the present never feels entirely new, even when everything looks different on the surface. Modern societies inherit instincts long before they inherit explanations. When faced with uncertainty, they do not pause to reason from first principles. They react using patterns that once kept their systems intact. These reactions shape policy, innovation, and conflict in ways that feel rational from the inside and baffling from the outside. In systems trained to preserve continuity, modern change is often approached as something to be integrated rather than unleashed. New ideas are assessed for how they affect balance. Reform is preferred over rupture. Adjustment is layered onto existing structures so that the core remains recognizable. This creates resilience across long spans of time. Institutions endure. Social order remains legible, but it also slows response when conditions shift faster than gradual adaptation. Even when speed is required, in systems trained by disruption, modern change feels less threatening. Rapid shifts are familiar. Swings are expected to evolve or disappear. Immunization is pursued aggressively, even when outcomes are uncertain. Failure is reframed as iteration. This produces bursts of acceleration that can reshape entire industries or regions quickly, but it also carries volatility. Inequality widens. The same tolerance for disruption that enables progress also exposes many to loss. These differences surface most clearly during moments of global stress, economic collapse, technological upheaval, environmental crisis. Some systems respond by tightening coordination, centralizing authority. Each response feels obvious to the system using it. Each feels irresponsible to the other. The disagreement is not about facts, it is about what kind of risk feels survivable. This is why cooperation across systems is so difficult. Even when goals align, shared problems demand shared response, but shared response requires shared assumptions about authority. When those assumptions differ, coordination breaks down. Each side interprets the other's caution or urgency as failure of judgment rather than difference of training. Friction follows even when intentions match. Over time, these mismatches shape global institutions. Agreements are written with hidden assumptions about compliance and enforcement. Policies succeed in some regions and fail in others, not because of capacity, but because they collide with deeply embedded expectations. What works feels obvious in one context and unworkable in another. Individuals experience this divergence as cultural difference, but culture is only the visible layer. Beneath it lie systems that taught people what to fear, what to protect, and what to risk. These lessons are absorbed early and rarely questioned because they operate below awareness. By the time people are asked to cooperate globally, their instincts are already trained. This does not mean convergence is impossible. It means it is costly. Real convergence requires unlearning habits that once ensured survival. It requires tolerating forms of risk that feel unnatural. It requires systems to loosen structures that have provided stability for generations. Few societies do this voluntarily. Most wait until pressure becomes unavoidable. That is why the modern world feels unstable. Different systems are being forced into constant interaction under conditions of rapid change. The old distances that once allowed divergence to proceed quietly no longer exist. Everyone feels exposed, everyone feels misstood, and everyone responds using instincts shaped by histories that others do not share, understanding. This does not solve the problem, but it reframes it. The question is no longer who is right or wrong, advanced or backward. The question is what kinds of systems can adapt without breaking, and at what cost. The answers will not be the same everywhere, because the training was never the same to begin with. What lies ahead will depend less on knowledge than on flexibility, less on intention than on whether systems can loosen their grip on what once kept them alive. The future will not erase the past. It will test how deeply it still governs response long after its original purpose has faded. That test is already underway, unfolding unevenly across societies that respond to the same signals in very different ways. Technological acceleration compresses time, removing the buffer that once allowed slow systems to adapt gradually. Information spreads instantly, but interpretation, systems trained to regulate change, attempt to slow its effects, filtering inputs to preserve coherence. Systems trained to compete amplify inputs, pushing them outward in search of advantage. The same signal produces opposite reactions, not because of disagreement over fact of instability can be survived. This divergence shows itself in how societies handle innovation. Where continuity is prized, innovation is expected to arrive with safeguards, rules, and integration plans. Progress must justify itself by strengthening order. Where disruption is familiar, innovation is expected to break things first and stabilize as progress. Excess filtering can delay response until options narrow. Excess acceleration can create damage faster than repair can follow. Neither system is wrong. Each is constrained by what it can tolerate without tearing itself apart. Global institutions struggle because they are built on assumptions that do not travel well. Agreements presume compliance that feels natural in some systems and intrusive in others. Enforcement mechanisms feel necessary in one context and threatening in another. When coordination fails, explanations revert to culture or character because structure remains invisible. Frustration grows not from malice, but from incompatible expectations about authority. Trust and acceptable loss. In moments of rapid threat, systems do not invent new responses. They default to trained ones. Some tighten control, centralize decision-making, and prioritize uniform response. Others decentralize, allow variation, and accept uneven outcomes. Each side watches the other and sees recklessness or rigidity. Each believes the other is increasing risk. In reality, both are reducing the risk they know how to measure. Individuals feel this strain as contradiction. They are told to innovate and to preserve, to move fast and to be careful, to cooperate globally and to protect local stability. These demands collide because they come from systems umtin for different pressures. People are asked to bridge gaps that were centuries in the making, using instincts trained for environments that no longer exist. Education, media, and policy attempt to reconcile these differences by appealing to shared values, but values sit on top of structure, not the other way around. Without acknowledging the structural training beneath behavior, appeals misfire. They sound reasonable to those already aligned and threatening to those who are not. Resistance is misread as ignorance. Urgency is misread as irresponsibility. The cycle repeats. What makes the present moment fragile is not disagreement, but speed. Change is arriving faster than systems can slowly retrain instincts. Many societies lack that margin. When the cost of error feels existential, systems retreat to what once worked. Even if conditions have changed, survival memory overrides analysis. Yet this moment also reveals possibility. Systems can learn from one another when pressure is managed, rather than overwhelming. These hybrids are fragile, but they hint at paths that do not require abandoning stability or embracing chaos wholesale. They require acknowledging that different responses evolve for different reasons, and that borrowing must include structure, not just technique. The future will be shaped less by who adopts which technology and more by who can adjust tolerance without losing coherence. Societies that can widen the range of acceptable response without collapsing may find new balance. Those that cannot may oscillate between rigidity and rupture. Outcomes will vary, not because history favors one side, but because adaptation carries different costs depending on what has been protected for so long. Understanding this does not guarantee coordination, but it reduces surprise. It replaces moral judgment with structural awareness. It explains why persuasion often fails and why pressure backfires. Systems defend what they have learned to trust. They loosen only when safety allows it. Any path forward that ignores this will repeat the same collisions under new names. And so the question returns, not as a comparison between regions, but as a challenge shared by all of them. Whether systems shaped by past survival can learn to survive a future that no longer resembles the conditions that trained them, without losing the people who depend on them to feel safe. And whether that learning can happen without forcing every system to abandon what once kept it alive. The future does not offer a clean reset. It arrives layered on top of inherited instincts, asking societies to respond to conditions that no longer match the training embedded in their structures. What feels sensible in one place still feels dangerous in another, even when evidence suggests otherwise. This is not stubbornness. It is memory and code in systems rather than minds. As pressures converge, the temptation to rank responses grows stronger. Some paths appear faster, others appear safer. Comparison turns into judgment, and judgment turns into conflict disguised as advice. Yet speed without stability collapses, and stability without adjustment stagnates. The problem is not choosing one over the other. It is that systems were never designed to balance both at once. They were designed to survive specific kinds of threat, and those threats are no longer neatly separated. This is why imitation so often fails. Societies copy outcomes without copying the constraints that produce them. Policies are imported without the structures that make them workable. Technologies are adopted without the habits that make them safe. When failure follows, it is blamed on culture or incompetence rather than mismatch. The lesson is missed again. Structure matters more than surface. The deepest divide, then, is not between East and West, or old and new, or tradition and progress. It is between systems that learn to trust control and systems that learn to trust adaptation, each facing a world that now demands both at once. Neither instinct disappears easily. Each resists dilution, because dilution once meant death. What history shows is not that one path was right and the other wrong, but that both were locally optimal under different conditions. The danger comes when those conditions change faster than systems can relearn. In those moments, insisting on inherited certainty becomes liability, but abandoning it abruptly feels like stepping into chaos. The tension between those fears defines the present more than any ideology. If there is a lesson buried in a long arc of divergence, it is not about superiority. It is about awareness. Systems that can recognize their own training gain a narrow window of choice. They can decide where to hold firm and where to loosen. They can experiment without collapsing and preserve without freezing. This requires patience, humility, and tolerance for ambiguity, qualities that no system is naturally good at cultivating under pressure. The future will not erase difference. It will test whether difference can coexist without turning every mismatch into a fault line. That test will not be passed through persuasion alone, nor through force. It will be passed, if at all, through redesigning how systems absorb risk, share burden, and allow change without treating it as threat. What began as small adjustments to land and survival became habits, then structures, then power, then thought. What comes next depends on whether thought can finally look back at its own foundations without fear. Not to undo them, but to understand their limits. Because the world no longer asks the same questions it once did, even though the answers still feel instinctively right. And the quiet truth beneath all of it is this: Humans did not become different because they wanted to. They became different because different worlds taught them different ways to feel safe. Until that is understood, every attempt to move forward together will feel like asking someone to abandon safety itself. That feeling sits beneath every modern debate, quietly shaping what people defend and what they fear losing. When systems believe their way of staying safe is under threat, they react before reasoning has time to intervene. Policies harden, language sharpens, compromise feels like exposure rather than cooperation. From the inside, this reaction feels responsible. From the outside, it looks inflexible. Both impressions are true at the same time. In societies where stability has long been preserved through coordination and control, uncertainty is interpreted as a signal to reinforce structure. Rules multiply, oversight expands, consistency becomes reassurance. The system does not experience this as restriction, but as care. Reducing variation feels like protecting people from harm they cannot yet see. Even resistance is interpreted as something to be managed rather than debated, because debate itself can introduce instability. In societies where survival depended on adaptation and competition, uncertainty triggers movement instead, boundaries loosen, experiments proliferate. Often when many fail, this does not feel reckless from within. It feels honest. If no single structure can be trusted completely, spreading risk across many attempts feels safer than relying on one authority. Loss is accepted as part of progress because stagnation feels more dangerous than error. These instincts clash most sharply when systems are forced to act together. Shared threats demand shared response, but shared response requires agreement on what kind of risk is acceptable. When one side tightens and the other accelerates, each sees the other increasing danger. Coordination breaks not because goals differ, but because safety is defined differently. One side measures safety by predictability, the other by adaptability. Attempts to bridge this gap often fail because they target behavior rather than instinct. Calls for cooperation assume shared tolerance for loss. Appeals to innovation assume shared tolerance for instability. Without addressing what each system has been trained to fear, solutions feel imposed rather than supportive. This is why moments that appear purely political or ideological often feel so emotional. They are not arguments about policy alone, they are arguments about what kind of world feels survivable. When people defend structure or push for disruption, they are often defending the conditions under which their system has learned to keep them safe. Asking them to reverse that instinct without providing new security feels like asking them to step into danger, blindfolded. Over time, this tension shapes not only institutions, but individuals. People raised inside different systems carry different thresholds for uncertainty. Some feel uneasy when rules loosen, others feel constrained when they tighten. These reactions are not signs of ignorance or bad faith. They are learned responses reinforced across generations. They surfaced automatically under stress. Recognizing this does not resolve conflict, but it changes how conflict is understood. It shifts the question from who is obstructing progress to what kind of safety is being protected. It reveals why persuasion alone rarely works and why pressure often backfires. Systems do not abandon what they trust unless something else earns that trust first. If any convergence is possible, it begins here, not by erasing difference, but by designing responses that reduce fear on both sides. Coordination allows room for variation, experimentation that does not threaten collapse, structures that can flex without breaking. These are not simple solutions. They require patience and an acceptance that no single instinct will be sufficient on its own. What lies ahead will not be decided by which system proves superior in theory. It will be decided by which systems can widen their definition of safety without losing coherence. That capacity, more than intelligence or resources, will shape how societies navigate a world that no longer resembles the one that trained them. And until that widening happens, history will continue to feel like collision rather than convergence, not because humans refuse to understand one another, but because understanding alone has never been enough to make people feel safe And widening that definition is far harder than it sounds, because safety is not an abstract idea inside a system. It is lived experience, reinforced every time things go wrong and the familiar response still works. When a crisis passes and order holds, or when disruption leads to recovery, the lesson is burned in again. The system remembers success far more clearly than it remembers near misses. Over time, this selective memory hardens preference into conviction. This is why reform often stalls even when problems are widely recognized. A system can see its limits and still cling to them, because those limits are tied to survival stories that feel personal and immediate. Change that threatens to remove a known protection feels more dangerous than a problem that has been lived with for generations. From the inside, endurance feels wiser than experimentation. From the outside, hesitation looks like refusal. The gap is not awareness, it is trust. Attempts to force change usually deepen resistance. Pressure activates the very instincts. Reform hopes to soften. Control tightens where looseness is demanded. Acceleration intensifies where restraint is advised. Each side becomes proof for the other's fears. What could have been gradual adjustment turns into confrontation, and confrontation teaches systems to defend rather than adapt. Even well-intended intervention can strengthen the patterns it seeks to break. Learning across systems succeeds only under specific condition. The risk of failure must be shared, the cost of experimentation must be limited, and the benefits must arrive without demanding immediate abandonment of familiar safeguards. When these conditions are missing, borrowing becomes superficial, symbols are copied, dates are imported, but the deeper structure remains unchanged, and mismatch produces disappointment. History shows that the most durable shifts happen not at moments of triumph, but at moments of managed vulnerability. Periods when systems are stressed enough to question themselves, but not so threatened that they retreat entirely into defense. In those narrow windows, hybrid responses can form. Nation learns to allow variation. These hybrids are fragile, often temporary, but they demonstrate that instincts are not destiny. The difficulty is that such windows cannot be commanded. They emerge unevenly, shaped by circumstance rather than design. Some societies encounter them early, others encounter them late, or not at all. Outcomes diverge, not because of will or intelligence, but because timing determines whether fear overwhelms learning or leaves space for it. In the modern world, timing is compressed, crises arrive faster and overlap. There is little space to fail safely. This makes hybrid learning harder, not easier. Systems fall back on what they know because they are asked to respond before trust in anything new can form. The demand for immediate results crowds out patience, and without patience, unlearning cannot begin. What this produces is a world where everyone feels behind and under threat at the same time. Each system sees others moving in ways that feel reckless or constraining. Each feels misunderstood. Each believes it is acting responsibly under impossible conditions. The conflict is not simply over outcomes, but over which risks are tolerable when time itself feels hostile. Understanding this does not create agreement, but it clarifies why agreement is so rare. It explains why progress feels uneven, and why attempts to synchronize responses often fracture systems are not just coordinating policy. They're negotiating safety memories that were built under entirely different worlds. The challenge ahead is not to convince systems to abandon those memories, but to create conditions where new memories can form without catastrophe. That requires slowing some processes while accelerating others, protecting stability in one domain while allowing experimentation in another. It requires designs that acknowledge fear instead of dismissing it. Whether such designs can spread fast enough is uncertain, but without them, difference will continue expressing itself as friction rather than complementarity. And the longer that friction persists, the more tempting it becomes to retreat into certainty. Even when certainty no longer fits the world it claims to explain. Retreating into certainty offers comfort only in the short term. Over time, it narrows options until systems find themselves strong in familiar conditions and fragile everywhere else. The world no longer presents problems one at a time, Pressures overlap. Climate, technology, migration, and conflict interact in ways that older responses were never designed to handle simultaneously. Certainty simplifies, but it also blinds. What feels safe becomes brittle when conditions refuse to stay within known boundaries. When systems struggle, the explanation offered is usually incompetence or corruption. Rarely is it acknowledged that the response being used was umpined for a different kind of threat. Blame replaces diagnosis. Pressure replaces redesign. And under pressure, systems double down on the instincts that once worked, even when those instincts now amplify damage. The danger here is not collapse alone, but mislearning. When responses fail, the lesson drawn is often that they were not applied forcefully enough. Control should have been tighter. Competition should have been fiercer. The possibility that the response itself no longer fits the problem is dismissed because questioning it feels like removing the last layer of protection. Failure becomes justification rather than warning. Yet history suggests another path exists, narrow and difficult though it is. Systems that survive long transitions are rarely those that cling hardest to certainty or abandon it entirely. They are those that learn to separate what must remain stable from what can be experimented with. Spaces where failure does not threaten collapse. This is not indecision, it is structural humility. Such humility is rare because it requires admitting that survival lessons are context-dependent. What saved a system once may limit it now, acknowledging that truth feels like betrayal of ancestors, institutions, and identities built on endurance. But endurance without adaptation eventually turns into inertia, and inertia, under accelerating pressure, becomes vulnerability. The hardest shift is not technical, it is emotional. Systems must learn to tolerate the feeling of uncertainty without immediately neutralizing it. They must allow unfamiliar responses to exist long enough to be tested rather than dismissed. This requires trust. The stability softens. That trust cannot be demanded. It has to be earned through design. Design in this sense means building buffers that absorb failure without spreading fear. It means distributing risk so that no single experiment threatens the whole. It means slowing feedback loops so that mistakes teach rather than terrify. These are not abstract ideals. They are practical conditions under which new survival memories can form. If such memories take hold, difference stops being threat and becomes information. Systems begin learning from one another without needing to become one another. Cunination borrows adaptability. Adaptation borrows contributir. They are condicurized. They regain usefulness. This is not convergence into sameness. It is alignment without erasure. A recognition that different worlds train different responses, and that the future may require drawing from more than one at the same time. The cost of this learning is discomfort. The cost of avoiding it is rigidity under pressure. Whether humanity can manage the shift remains uncertain. The conditions that allow it are fragile and unevenly distributed, but the alternative is clearer. Without new ways to absorb risk, systems will continue colliding, each defending its certainty, each interpreting friction as proof of the other's failure. The long story that began with humans walking into different lands now returns to a shared problem. The world is changing faster than inherited instincts can comfortably manage. Survival no longer depends on choosing the right side of an old divide. It depends on recognizing how those divides were formed and deciding deliberately where they still protect life and where they quietly endanger it. That choice will not announce itself as a turning point. It will appear, as it always has, as small adjustments made under pressure. The difference this time is that those adjustments will be made with awareness rather than accident, or not at all. And awareness changes the meaning of choice, even when options remain limited. When systems recognize that their instincts were trained rather than ordained, they gain a narrow but real margin of agency, not the freedom to become something else overnight, but the ability to pause before reacting in the only way that once felt safe. That pause is small. It is often invisible, but it is where different futures begin, separating from the momentum of the past. In practical terms, this awareness shows up as restraint where certainty once ruled. It appears as willingness to test without committing the whole structure. Systems begin asking different questions, not about whether control or competition is correct, but about where each is still necessary. Authority becomes more conditional. Immotivation becomes more selective. Stability is protected deliberately, rather than reflexively. Change is allowed in bounded spaces, where failure does not threaten collapse. If systems were shaped by circumstance, then outcomes are not proof of virtue or failure, they are evidence of fit. That realization weakens moral certainty, and moral certainty has long been a source of cohesion. Letting it go can feel like dissolving shared identity, yet clinging to it forces societies to defend structures, even when those structures produce harm under new conditions. At the individual level, this awareness reframes difference. People begin noticing that what feels obvious to them is not universal. Disagreement stops being interpreted immediately as ignorance or malice. It becomes signal. Why does this response feel safe here and threatening there? Or pressure trained that instinct? These questions slow judgment. Slower judgment reduces escalation. Reduction in escalation creates space for learning that was previously crowded out by fear. None of this eliminates conflict. Systems will still compete, interests will still clash, power will still matter, but conflict informed by structural awareness behaves differently. It is less surprised by resistance, less tempted by simplification, less likely to mistake compliance for understanding or opposition for irrationality. It anticipates friction and designs around it instead of denying it. The risk, of course, is that awareness arrives too late or too unevenly. Some systems may adapt while others harden. That imbalance can create new tensions. Flexibility in one place can look like weakness to a system trained to equate stability with strength. Conversely, rigidity can look like threat to a system trained to expect change. Navigating this asymmetry requires patience that pressure rarely allows. Yet history suggests that moments of greatest danger also open space for re-evaluation. When old responses repeatedly fail, denial becomes harder to sustain. Systems begin experimenting not because they desire novelty, but because necessity leaves no alternative. The question is whether those experiments are guided by understanding or driven by panic. Panic reproduces old patterns more violently. What emerges from this process will not be a single model of society. It will be a range of arrangements that manage uncertainty in different ways, borrowing selectively from each other without pretending to erase difference. The goal is not uniformity, it is compatibility, systems that can interact without constant friction, differences that inform rather than destabilize. The long arc of divergence does not end with resolution. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility to recognize how deeply past survival shaped present behavior. Responsibility to design futures that do not mistake inherited instinct for eternal truth. Responsibility to protect what still works while releasing what no longer does. The story that began with humans moving into different lands now asks a different question. Not why we became different, but whether we can remain different without turning that difference into permanent collision. The answer will not come from history alone. It will come from whether awareness can translate into structure before pressure forces the choice for us. Translating that awareness into structure is the hardest step because structure is where instinct hides most effectively. Ideas can change quickly, language can shift, but routine, incentives, and authority move slowly, especially when they are tied to survival memory. Systems may agree in principle that adaptation is necessary, yet still behave as if the old threats are about to return. The gap between understanding and action is where most attempts at change stall. What works in this gap is not persuasion, but redesigned small changes that alter incentives without demanding belief. Adjustments that make safer behavior easier and risky behavior less necessary. When systems change how decisions are rewarded, people adapt without needing to be convinced. Over time, new habits form. Those habits, if they reduce fear rather than increase it, can begin retraining instinct itself. This is why surface reforms so often disappoint. Technologies arrive, but are used to reinforce existing control or competition. Education promotes openness, but institutions reward conformity or rivalry as before. The visible layer shifts while the underlying structure remains intact. When results fail to match expectation, trust erodes and skepticism grows toward the idea. It appears as redistribution of risk so that failure does not cascade, as decoupling of innovation from survival, so that experimentation does not threaten stability, as layering authority so that no single response dominates under every condition. These designs do not feel revolutionary, they feel cautious, but caution, when deliberate, is different from fear. It creates room for learning instead of shutting it down. Examples of this already exist, though they are rarely recognized as such. Systems that allow local experimentation within national frameworks, markets that operate inside regulatory boundaries, institutions that separate long-term planning from short-term reaction. These arrangements are imperfect, but they show that hybrid instincts can coexist when structure supports them. The success of such systems depends less on ideology than on whether they reduce perceived threat on both sides. The danger is that pressure often pushes in the opposite direction. Prizes concentrate authority, urgency rewards, speed over reflection. Short-term survival eclipses long-term adjustment. In these moments, systems revert to their deepest training, control tightens, competition intensifies. The window for redesign narrows. What might have been gradual adaptation becomes abrupt rupture, yet even rupture can create opportunity if it is followed by restraint. After shock, systems sometimes loosen not because they want to, but because rigidity has been exhausted. In those moments, memory is briefly interrupted. Old certainties lose some of their grip. If redesign follows quickly, new habits can take root before fear reasserts itself. Timing matters. Awareness without timing fades. Timing without awareness panics. Some regions will redesign deliberately. Others will oscillate between extremes. Some will cling to certainty until it fails catastrophically. Others will experiment too broadly and fracture. These outcomes will not align neatly with geography or tradition. They will align with whether systems can balance continuity and adaptation. What remains constant is that difference itself is not the problem. Unmanaged difference is. Systems that understand their own training can engage others without assuming threat. Systems that do not will continue interpreting mismatch as hostility. The choice is not between unity and division. It is between friction that educates and friction that escalates. As the long story draws toward its end, the conclusion is less dramatic than the beginning. There is no final split to explain everything, no single cause to blame. There is only accumulation, small adjustments layered over time, swings that outlive their original purpose, instincts that remain useful in some contexts and dangerous in others. The question now is whether humanity can do what it has rarely done before: adjust deliberately rather than reactively, learn from difference rather than defend against it. Design systems that can hold multiple instincts at once without collapsing into fear. The answer will not appear as a declaration. It will show up as quiet shifts in how risk is shared, how authority is constrained, how experimentation is protected. If those shifts spread, difference may stop feeling like destiny and start feeling like resource. And if they do not, history will continue along familiar paths, not because they are inevitable, but because no one built an alternative sturdy enough to be trusted when pressure returned. And that is where the story rests. Not with an answer that divides the world cleanly, but with an understanding that softens the edges of the divide itself. Humans did not branch into different paths because some thought better, planned better, or deserved more. They drifted because the world asked different things of them, and over long stretches of time, those requests trained different instincts about safety, order, and change. What looks today like contrast in values, systems, or outcomes is the surface expression of much older adaptations. Ways of organizing life that once reduced danger became habits. Habits hardened into structure. Structure shaped power, power trained thought, and thought repeated across generations, came to feel like nature itself. None of this required intention, none of it required belief. It unfolded quietly while people focused on surviving. The next season, this is why simple explanation, fail, intelligence, culture, destiny. These are names applied after the fact. The deeper cause lies in how different environments rewarded different responses, and how those responses, once stabilized, protected themselves from change. Difference persisted not because people wanted it to, but because systems remembered what had kept them alive. Understanding this does not erase conflict, but it reframes it. It shifts the question from who is right to what each system has learned to fear. It explains why persuasion alone rarely works, and why force only hardens resistance. It reveals that beneath disagreement lies something more fragile than belief. Safety. The future will not return humanity to a single path, that moment passed long ago. What remains possible is something quieter and harder. Learning to recognize which instincts still protect life and which now limit it. Learning to loosen some structures without collapsing others. Learning to let difference exist without turning it into threat. The world no longer resembles the conditions that shape these systems, but the systems still respond as if it does. Whether that response leads to repeated collision or gradual alignment depends on awareness turning into design before pressure makes the choice for us. History does not demand sameness. It demands understanding of how we became what we are. And in the end, the difference between Europe and Asia, between any two parts of the world, is not a story of separation by nature or ability. It is a record of how the same humans learn different ways to feel safe in different worlds, and then carry those lessons forward long after the world had changed. That is not destiny. It is memory.